By the time the lamps were lit along the south walk and the shadows in the cloister took on their characteristic, gently disciplined order, the guests at the Silent Abbey had arranged themselves to suit. That was the curious property of the place. It persuaded people into shapes that seemed inevitable. Lady Honoria Vale, who owned it and called her ownership a long guardianship, liked it to be so. She stood at the threshold of the refectory where the exhibition was hung, receiving with a delicate precision which contrived to look unstudied. "It is an abbey," she said more than once, and in varying tones according to the social altitude of her listener, and we remember, after our fashion, what that meant. "There is a great silence at 9. In the refectory the walls were whitewashed, monastic and rather austere. The iron sconce lamps threw a steady light. Between them were fixed Ambrose Fielding's canvases. They were a series entitled Stations of Silence, and if they were not wholly to every taste, they had the advantage of looking made for their place. Fielding himself, with a coat too loosely cut for a fashionable painter, and hands stained by something improbably permanent, had been guided to the less bristling corners of the room where patrons liked to discover an artist and confide their discoveries to him. "They're not devout," he said to Dr. Edwin Ferris, the warden, who had come down from Cambridge with his scholarly patience and admirable tone. "They're about quiet, which is worse, I dare say." "Worse," repeated Dr. Ferris, approvingly amused. "You rescue silence from piety and lay it bare. The nuns would clap." "They were monks," said Fielding, not looking at him. Lady Honoria's niece, Venetia, debutante this season, though the term offended her as domestic jargon might, drifted between groups with a silk that did not rustle because her maid had scolded it into obedience. Her face had beauty of the incurable kind. If she returned a glance, it was with a courtesy that implied she had noticed one's glance long before and had filed it away. Her eyes touched Theo Armitage's face more than once. He was the young director of the Foundation's experimental theater wing and carried his responsibility like a contralto carries a melody, low and uninsistent, so that people leaned forward to hear. Miranda Lascelles arrived late, with the sort of lateness that cues a small movement of heads. She was in a dark green that made an end of nonsense about seasons, and if her voice was pitched to the stage, she moderated it here with an almost conventual tact. "I shall be very good," she promised Lady Honoria, as if speaking for an audience. "I shall whisper to nobody after 9. "Not even to yourself," said Lady Honoria. "It is the habit that interests me." "The habit," murmured Sir Julian Rackham, who had been a general and had the controlled gravity of men who have issued orders watched by death, "is what one has left when one knows one's reasons are insufficient." "Sir Julian," said Lady Honoria, "you must stand where you do not interrupt Mr. Fielding's 9th station." "If I understood it, I should be delighted not to interrupt it," Sir Julian replied. He did not move, and she allowed the offence to be mutual. Mr. Pym, the butler, moved from group to group like a careful punctuation. He had the looks of a man for whom a tray is an organ and a cloche a vowel. It would have been difficult to say whether he saw everything or nothing. He took away a glass before it fell and put a glass in a hand that did not know it wanted one. Mrs. Dace, the housekeeper, had a way of appearing in doorways which reminded people of school and of winter. She had a small notebook and looked at it as if what she wrote in it would alter what had already happened, if only she chose the words. In the South Walk, Dr. Ferris was explaining to a banker's wife that the Cistercians had prized simplicity but not suffered from it. In the chapter house, Theo touched Venetia's elbow and indicated the stage at the far end, a shallow platform where workmen had smoothed the stone and laid down a canvas floor. Tomorrow there would be a rehearsal of the dumb show, a mask that made a virtue out of the Abbey's rule. "I shall forget to be quiet," Venetia said. "Someone must remind me by force." "Force is vulgar," Theo said. "We have gestures." "And glances," said Miranda, who had arrived behind them without noise, "though one takes longer to learn them when one is no longer young." It depends how long one has had to practice, Venetia said, with a courtesy that was almost indecent. Ambrose Fielding stood for a moment in the archway that gave on the sacristy. He looked down at his hand, where a smear of cinnabar had settled in the lifeline, and rubbed it with a handkerchief that had failed, long ago, to be pristine. "It drafts," he said to no one in particular. "It drafts and blows the flame." Dr. Ferris turned on him a voice polished by tutorials. "That is the place where the lay brother kept the keys. There is a slot under the sill. It breeds a thin wind whenever you need it least." "Then lock it," Fielding said, as if locks could be instructed in manners. Mr. Lionel Quayle, Lady Honoria's secretary, passed with the thin respectfulness of a man whose success lies in proving he has not been there. He bent at her shoulder to murmur an appointment for Monday, which could not, in any conceivable sense, be urgent. At 9, the bell in the little belfry above the west porch sent its chaste sound into the rooms. It was not loud, and it was not the note of any parish bell. It was simply clear, and it fell through conversation as a hand falls through water. People did not stop in mid-syllable, because such gestures belong to theatres. They finished their thoughts, and then they stopped. The Abbey accepted their decision. In the moment of decent confusion that followed, someone arranged Miranda's cloak about a chair back, and someone else shut a casement that had been opened by mistake. Mrs. Dace checked something off. Sir Julian stood looking at Fielding's 9th canvas, which was not an image, but a space. Theo moved toward the sacristy door and found it, as Fielding had predicted, not sitting properly on its latch. He attended to it. The latch fell with a sound as small and exact as a dropped pin. The great silence laid itself over them all like a garment. Their faces altered in it. The frivolous ones became lovely, and the grave ones tender. In the cloister, the lamps hummed very faintly, and the scent of orris from a lady's glove lay like a thought in the air. Somewhere in the east range a board creaked, very slowly, as if it remembered feet. With the tolerance that comes of good breeding and habit, they separated into pairs and singles and let their breaths say what they could not. The Abbey received them and began, in its undemonstrative way, to make choices. The Abbey's silence settled with the unarguable authority of something practiced for centuries. It was not a prohibition so much as an agreement with the stone and air. People moved in it with the mild self-consciousness of those who have elected to be better than they are for a little while. The soft whir of the heaters in the refectory seemed suddenly audible. The iron sconces hummed like bees. 2 lamps were extinguished in the chapter house, as they always were at 9, but one, near the shallow platform, remained burning, an omission that passed at first for intention. Venetia, abandoning speech with the obedient grace that made older women approve her and younger men restless, stepped into the cloister and paced it once, twice, marking the rhythm with the fall of her silk. At the chapter house door she looked in. The single lamp threw an amber triangle across the smooth stone of the makeshift stage. On it lay a white half-mask, with an elastic tied too tight. The effect was of a gesture waiting for a face. Venetia's glance found and left it without surprise. A figure sat beyond in the first row of chairs, no more than a density in the dimness, and because it did not move when she did, she read it as courtesy and passed on. In the refectory, Ambrose Fielding, deprived of talk, regarded his stations with a look that, on a more voluble night, would have been explained away as artistic possession. Sir Julian, by the fireplace, had made a small tent of his fingers. His gaze went from the window to the door and back again, as if charting the habit of people and seeing it, tonight, slightly altered. Dr. Ferris stood with his back to the canvas labeled Seventh, Interval. His stillness had an academic unworldliness that was almost theatrical. A little after the half-hour, one felt it rather than heard it. The great silence, which did not dissolve, but gently thinned, permitted certain civil noises. Mr. Pym appeared in the refectory with coffee, his progress as noiseless as a demonstration. He put down cups nobody had asked for, and paused, as if attending to an inward list. Lady Honoria, from her place, marked the stage in the chapter house as a hostess inventories without seeming to the conditions of her rooms. The lamp's refusal to be put out presented itself to her quietly. So too did the absence of Miranda Lascelles' particular green. She turned, found Theo Armitage's eye, and indicated, with a motion that registered as a question only because he chose to read it so, the direction from which the mask would take its rise tomorrow. Theo went. He had a way of moving in which his feet seemed to arrive a fraction after his thoughts. In the chapter house, the air was cooler and smelled of worked stone. He took in the platform, the half-mask, the chair with a dark shawl flung across it. Then he saw Miranda, not where Venetia had imagined her, but slightly to the right, seated and folded in upon herself, as if observing a pause for instruction. He stood for a moment because she might have been, could almost have been, waiting with a discipline that impressed him in rehearsal. The head lowered so that the line of the neck showed its length, the hands joined loosely in the lap, the back against the chair in a posture that had been taught. He said nothing. Speech would have been a discourtesy in that room even now, but his breath altered. He crossed the space and reached her with the efficient steps of a stage manager. Her hand was cool under his fingers. He did not, after the first involuntary shock, shake or call, because the Abbey forbade it, and because, in any case, there was nothing to be called back. He looked for something wrong, a scarf about the throat, a pratfall, the obvious theatre of harm, and found only an excellent stillness. On the floor near her chair lay one glove, palm upward, and beside it Inspector Roderick Alleyn arrived at the Abbey just after 6, when the September light was of that unemphatic kind which shows everything and announces nothing. The local superintendent, an anxious, careful man named Smallwood, met him in the South Walk and supplied, with a courteous economy, the facts. Mr. Ambrose Fielding had been found at the close of the Great Silence, seated on a stone bench at the edge of the chapter house platform, his head resting as if he had fallen asleep. A glass stood on the bench beside him. The physician from the village had come and gone, non-committal, troubled by the quietness of it. Lady Honoria had asked that Scotland Yard be consulted. The guests remained, as far as could be contrived, in their rooms or in the refectory. "Thank you," Alleyn said. He disliked to hurry an anxious man and did not do so now. "Let me see him as he was found." The chapter house had a simple monastic poise. The lowered platform at one end waited for tomorrow's mask and did not seem impatient. There were signs, very tidy signs, that people had tried not to move anything. Mr. Pym had done his discreet utmost. He had pulled back the heavy curtain that could be drawn across the entrance. He had placed a lantern there, and he had positioned himself at such a distance as suggested deference rather than vigilance. Fielding's body remained where it had been discovered. In the quiet grey of early morning, the artist looked younger, as the newly dead sometimes do. His hands, stained at the nails with a permanent blue, lay open on his knees. His head had tilted against the wall so that the profile was composed for a sculptor. The glass on the bench held the palest remainder of white wine. On the stone underfoot, no mess, no struggle. The clock of the Abbey, imperturbable, ticked once. It did not strike the hour. Alleyn drew nearer, not touching the body. He had that trick of attention that seems to kneel without bending. The faint odor of linseed and turpentine still clung about Fielding's clothes. Under it, something else, no clear vulgarity of almonds, none of the too startling cues popular with writers of romances. Rather a thin, medicinal ghost, easily mislaid. He let it pass and returned to what could be seen. The glass had been placed neatly, an inch from the bench's edge. The rim showed a minute crescent uncleaned, pigment, perhaps, ultramarine on a lip. On the stone at Fielding's left shoe, a tiny granule of something crystalline had caught the light. He held his breath and did not stir the air. "You've noted what you could without moving him," Alleyn murmured. "Yes, sir," Smallwood said. "Photographs, and Dr. Corbett will be ready once you've done." "Good. No one touched the glass?" "Mr. Pym took the tray away from the refectory last night after the silence. That glass wasn't on it when he collected. He says he found it this morning where it stands." Mr. Pym, from his distance, managed to convey that this account, while painfully bald, represented his conscience. Alleyn turned to the platform. A scattering of fine dust rucked along its edge showed 3 distinct marks, where feet had stood and pivoted in a constrained, stylized manner. He pictured a rehearsal of silent gestures, or someone trying them out long after 9. One mark, oddly, was smeared rather than pressed, as if a soul had been dragged, not by clumsiness, but by weight. He looked up. The draperied valance above the platform, newly hung, showed a faint bruise of darkness at one corner where somebody with dusty fingers had steadied himself. On the wall, just beyond the platform's reach, an iron sconce held an unlit candle. The wick had been snuffed with fingers, not a tool. The slightest feathering of ash clung to the sconce's rim. He filed it away without privileging it. The abbey had its own habits. He stood back. "Who saw him last?" Smallwood said, with the apologetic firmness of a man who knows his information is incomplete. "The great silence makes it awkward, sir. People were about. They moved as they do between the cloister, the refectory, and here. No talking. They couldn't say who passed whom. Mr. Armitage had shown Miss Vale the platform earlier, before the bell. Miss Lascelles, came this way after 9 for a moment and went back. Sir Julian Rackham was in the library. Dr. Ferris writes that he returned to his room. Lady Honoria walked in the cloister." He paused. "Mr. Fielding was seen with a glass before the bell. Mr. Pym served." Alleyn inclined his head. "And Mr. Pym?" The butler came forward a pace. He had a widow's peak of white hair and a beige voice. "Sir, I set out a tray in the refectory. White wine and barley water, as is customary, with small biscuits because the silence can be fatiguing for guests unaccustomed. After the bell, I remained in the pantry. I do not circulate during the hour. It disturbs the impression. You found the glass here this morning?" "Yes, sir." "And no one speaks after 9, Alleyn said lightly, "except the bell, which has its own ideas." He remained where he was, watching the room accept his presence without telling him anything. From the cloister came the low rub of a shoe and then stillness. On the platform, the strained little marks kept their counsel. In the glass, the unlucky crescent of blue looked almost festive. He thought of Troy and, unexpectedly, of how she used to say that composition lies less in what is arranged than in what is missing. He did not ask, who could have wished Fielding dead? He let the thought pass, returned to the pale residue in the glass and to the kind of silence that is practiced rather than innate. It had a shape. He meant to learn it. Alleyn preferred, when the air was delicate and old stones listened, to let people talk in their own registers. He chose Lady Honoria's morning room again. It had windows on the cloister and, by some trick of its paneling, kept confidences the way good servants do. Fox sat a little back with his notebook, his large hands disposed with an air of inconsequence that deceived nobody. Lady Honoria was first, not because of rank alone, but because courtesy demanded it. She settled with her back to the light, her profile composed and fine. "You will have discovered we keep certain observances," she said. "They are not imposed. One adopts them or one does not return." "The great silence at 9, Alleyn said. "Mr. Fielding observed it." "He did. He mocked nothing. If anything, he endowed our small rules with more meaning than we do." "And the scriptorium?" "It is always locked," she replied almost too quickly and moderated her tone. "That is to say, my manuscripts are there. Pym and I hold keys. If last night it was open, we shall have to determine how and why. Mr. Fielding was permitted to work there. Not to work. He asked to sit there once or twice. He said the light was honest. She allowed herself a small sigh. He had an appetite for honesty. Alleyn let that rest and asked, almost idly, whether there had been any friction. Lady Honoria's smile was very slight. My dear Inspector, artists are friction, but not quarrels, if that is your meaning. A few strained moments, perhaps. Miss Lascelles is naturally forceful, Mr. Armitage protective of his theatre wing, Sir Julian protective of my niece. Dr. Ferris is a scholar and dislikes being sketched without his consent. Sketched. Ambrose made studies, she said. He said he never lied in a line. There are those who would prefer a small, kind lie. Sir Julian Rackham presented punctuality and a polished stick. He took his chair as if it were a post to be held. A sad business, he said, the words shaped by habit. I met Fielding at dinner, spoke of his service with the medical corps in Italy. No nonsense about it. Sensible fellow in that regard. He paused. He had the look of a man who sees too much. Did you find his seeing uncomfortable? Sir Julian regarded Alleyn as one soldier measuring another. I do not confess discomfort to strangers, Inspector. I will say this. He looked at my goddaughter with an eye I did not relish. Not because it was improper, but because it was appraising. I do not like one of your clinical chaps making estimates, even benign ones, of a young girl who has not yet learnt to protect herself. Miss Vale requires protection? She requires time, Sir Julian said, and shut himself at once with a firm quiet. Dr. Ferris brought the Cambridge manner like a gown that had been brushed and hung properly. Fielding was interesting chiefly as an ethical problem, he told Alleyn, and then looked faintly apologetic. Forgive me. One reduces people in one's mind to theses. He had the virtue and the fault of candor. You saw him last at 9:05. He stood in the refectory by his station of a monk in profile. He smiled at me in a way I cannot interpret. It seemed to say, you will understand later. This is, I concede, projection. Did he drink tea? Chamomile, Ferris said unexpectedly. He said it helped him ignore his nerves. He had no cup then. After 9, of course. We refrain. Miranda Lascelles took the sofa as if it were a chaise on a bare stage and arranged sincerity over herself like a shawl. I adored Ambrose, she began in a voice one reserves for eulogies and lovers. He was cruelly observant, but kind in his cruelty. He stood too still. It made one fidget. Did you quarrel? Alleyn asked, so mildly that she smiled. Not in a way that would excite anyone. He thought my face had learnt too many tricks. He said so. I told him his canvases had learnt too few. It was lightweight, darling. People at the Abbey are not truly unkind. We only practice. And after 9, I sat with Lady Honoria in the chapter house. We were very silent, so dreadfully good. Theo Armitage came last of that theatrical pair, a slender man whose hands moved as if conducting some inaudible music. Ambrose's series troubled some of the trustees, he confessed with quiet loyalty. He made a study of our mask, a silent chorus, he said, of all the things we cannot say. He was right, which is usually inconvenient. He asked if he might show a sketch at the rehearsal today. I told him we should see. And did he show you the sketch? No. Theo looked down. He said only that it was finished. Venetia entered on a hush of clear perfume and self-command. She met Alleyn's gaze with grave civility. You must have such wearying days, she said, and did not mean it unkindly. Sometimes the days are instructive, Alleyn returned. Miss Vale, would you tell me how last evening ended for you? With the bell, she said. I was in the chapter house at 9. Afterwards I went to my room. I did not sleep, but that is uninteresting. On the contrary, Alleyn said. What detains sleep can be very interesting. She considered. Thoughts, she said. Ambrose had a way of making one's thoughts visible. It is unpleasant to see what one has thought. You liked him? I liked being taken seriously, Venetia said, very softly. And then, knowing she had said too much, she rose as if something had called her elsewhere. Mr. Pym appeared as if invoked, requesting the inspector's preference for coffee. Alleyn asked him, almost as an afterthought, whether the keys were in their usual place last night. Pym's eyes, that saw too much to be surprised, withheld an instant too long. They were where they should be, sir, he said. As to their use, well, Lady Honoria's wishes are always precisely observed. It was not what he said. It was the space he left around it. Alleyn nodded, accepted the coffee, and let the pause reseal itself. Thank you, he said. For now, that is all. We will trouble no one unnecessarily. He rose. The Abbey, very patient, seemed to draw breath. Somewhere in its routines, he thought, the truth had taken a misstep. It would be a small misstep. These people did not blunder noisily. He would find it where ritual and habit touched, very lightly, and failed to fit. Alleyn asked for Pym in the butler's pantry, a narrow, immaculate room that smelled faintly of starch and beeswax. A high shelf held the Abbey's smaller keys upon labeled hooks. Sacristy, muniments, organ loft, west tower. The scriptorium's long antique key, its tag written in a tidy feminine hand, was conspicuously absent, though Miss Casson, Lady Honoria's secretary, had already recorded in her book that it was in residence. Pym stood as one, stands in church. Sir, I should like to understand your evenings, Mr. Pym, Alleyn said. Not the exceptional ones, the proper, ordinary course. Pym's glance included the row of silver, the enamelled bell pushes, and the pantry clock. At 8, we clear the refectory. At past, Miss Casson secures the restricted rooms, save the chapter house, which remains open for the theatre's use. At 9:05, I take the herbals from the still room to the warming cupboard. Those who keep the great silence may steep their own. It is preferred that no footfall attend the silence, but where necessity persists, it proceeds without speech. Last night? The same, Pym said. I set out chamomile, lemon balm, and the quiet blend. The pots and cups stood in their accustomed order. Fox, who had stationed himself with sturdy unobtrusiveness by the door, said, "And Mr. Fielding's tea?" Pym's hands remained folded, but a breath passed through him, like a curtain stirred and stilled. "I did not serve Mr. Fielding individually, sir. He might have helped himself. One cup was taken, the chamomile canister shows it, and later found in the scriptorium." Alan's eyes touched the high shelf again. "The scriptorium key." "Miss Casson will tell you, sir," Pym replied, with the courtly obstinacy of his profession. "She is responsible for the keys." Miss Casson came at once when sent for, a slight woman with a neat mouth and handwriting to match. She stood as one stands before a tribunal of her own conscience. "You locked the scriptorium at 8:30, Alleyn said. "Yes, Inspector. I checked the case fastenings myself." She paused, as if to align a column. "I returned the key to Lady Honoria's study at once, placed it upon the hook, and entered the time in my book. You will find it there." "And later?" "I did not leave my office. There were accounts. One does not intrude upon the great silence. It is—" Her mouth found a word she trusted. "It is our habit." Alleyn let the silence run a moment between them. "You are certain you did not admit Mr. Fielding? Or any other?" Miss Casson inclined her head with scrupulous exactness. "I'm certain, Inspector. But the key was where it ought to be when we arrived," Fox put in, almost apologetically. "And the scriptorium door last night was ajar." Miss Casson's gaze rested on the ledger as if it were a child. "We are a small household, Mr. Fox. Some doors open when they should not. We do not make a scandal of it. Quite, said Alleyn, mild as rain. You keep the still-room ledger also? I do. And you were aware that a pot of chamomile was taken after the bell? She made the slightest of movements, a fractional withdrawal from the question rather than a refusal. It is customary for guests to serve themselves, Inspector. I do not supervise their choices. He smiled as if at a point conceded in a game. You observed no one near Lady Honoria's study between 8:30 and 9. Miss Casson's eyes rose, met his, and fell. The truth went by under cover. I could not say, Inspector. The corridors are poorly lit by design. Of course, murmured Alleyn. He found Mrs. Hesketh, the housekeeper, in the still room. Its shelves a small apothecary of domestic virtue, dried leaves in labelled jars, bundles of lavender tied with cotton tape, the spice drawers freshened with chalk. She had the resolute kindness of women who keep order not by fear, but by the insistence of clean linens. You set out the cups, Mrs. Hesketh. With my own hands, sir. We used the white crockery in the silence. Simple and quieting. Alleyn lifted a cup from the rack. All of them white, a fractional beat. Save one saucer, sir. The scullery broke a plane yesterday, and I made it up with one from Lady Honoria's Abbey garden set. It does not show in poor light. Her jaw tightened. It was returned this morning with a mark. No, I washed it. There is no need to trouble Lady Honoria. A mark? A shadow of blue at the lip, Mrs. Hesketh said, and then, with stubborn gentility, paint, no doubt. Mr. Fielding was not tidy with his fingers. Quite so, Alleyn agreed. He examined the canisters, the scoops, the small brown strainer with its patient mesh. Everything was in order with a correctness that felt almost devout, yet he had the intuition that order itself concealed a rearrangement. A cup moved, a key replaced, a saucer substituted with a logic that made sense only from within the habit that had made it. As they left the still room, Pym was in the passage with a tray. His glance touched Miss Casson and slid away with professional tact. It was a glance that contained a sentence he had chosen not to speak. Mr. Pym, Alleyn said, friendly as a guest. The great silence forbids talk, but not movement. Who moves most after the bell? Pym set the tray down, the cups hardly sounding. Those who attend to needs, sir. The house moves then. Quietly. And last night, said Alleyn, did it move more than is usual? Pym's voice was like a door gently closed. We should not say, sir. Alleyn's expression was amiable, almost idle. Within, the dust of intuition began to settle. A key restored to its hook with too much care. A saucer that did not belong, a household whose virtue was silence, and whose silence, last night, had been industrious. After his conversations with Pym and Miss Calthorpe, conversations notable less for what they yielded than for the silken care with which both avoided yielding anything at all, Alleyn returned to the scriptorium with Fox. Morning had ripened. A mild light pooled on the whitewashed stone, and the small chamber gave back its layered scents of wax and vellum with that studied indifference old rooms possess. He stood before the little table. The teacup, preserved as he had found it, seemed almost absurdly domestic in the monastic hush. He considered it as one considers a portrait, not for likeness merely, but for intention. You noticed it, he said, not looking round. Fox, who had a talent for answering questions that had half a dozen possible endings, said, I noticed what I think Pym would not have done, sir. Just so. Pym's habits were exact, and Alleyn, who respected exactness in its natural environment, had attended to them. In the morning room, the butler set spoons at the 3 o'clock position, handles pointing toward the dominant hand of the expected drinker. When serving ladies, he placed the handle at a more oblique angle, a flourish of consideration learned in a house where flourishes had once meant something. In the refectory, he used the heavy Abbey stoneware. For the private rooms, the veiled porcelain appeared, a delicate service with a faint columbine pattern, discreet to the point of self-effacement. The cup beside Fielding was of the Columbine set, but the spoon lay at 6 o'clock, handle toward the sitter. A small thing, one might say, yet in Pym's economy of gesture, small things were the grammar. There was also the saucer, hairline floor near the rim, an almost invisible crescent. Cracked porcelain, even delicately cracked, did not leave Pym's pantry for guests. Alleyn bent and touched the saucer lightly with a finger. "You see," he said to Fox, "someone made tea who was not Pym." Fox's quiet, "Yes, sir," contained assent without embellishment. There were other notes in the composition. The chamomile was not from the paper sachets stacked in the warming pantry, Pym's choice for those who professed nerviness after travel. These leaves had been loose and fairly recently cut. Their pollen had dusted the rim with a faint yellow bloom that Pym, with his perpetual cloth, would have polished away before offering the cup. Alleyn's glance moved to the small kettle on the iron trivet near the hearth. It was not a scriptorium kettle, for the scriptorium had no such thing. The Abbey's rule put flame in the still room and nowhere else after the 9th bell. Yet someone had brought a little spirit lamp and kettle here. That, too, ran contrary to ordinary practice, and ordinary practice at the Silent Abbey had the authority of ritual. He did not say so to Fox, but he thought, "The house runs on custom. A hand that moves against custom often leaves a mark." When Pym presently joined them, discretion personified, Alleyn returned to the subject of the Abbey's hours with a casualness that would not have deceived a less practiced man. "You take the great silence seriously, Mr. Pym." "We observe it, sir," Pym replied, in the tone of a man stating a point of doctrine rather than a personal preference. "And service? Service is arranged to precede it. Those who desire tisanes or other comforts make their wishes known beforehand. The bell does not forbid movement, Inspector, but it discourages it." "In that case," Alleyn said, eyes on the cup, "who would have provided Mr. Fielding with chamomile during the silence?" For the first time, Pym's gaze shifted not to the object under discussion, but toward the door, an almost imperceptible movement, and quickly corrected. "I could not say, sir." "You could," Alleyn thought, "but you will not." There was no malice in it, only a stewardship that had been trained to place personal conduct behind institutional dignity. He said, still mildly, "You are protector of more than trays here, Mr. Pym." Pym's face suggested he would not think it presumptuous for an inspector to observe the obvious. In the still room, Miss Calthorpe, Lady Honoria's secretary, a spare woman with a faculty for going unnoticed, showed them the row of labeled jars. She did so without being asked, which was to say she had anticipated the question and chosen the answer. "Chamomile," she said, opening a jar and allowing the dry, apple-sweet breath of it to rise. "We keep two. This," she touched the jar, "for Lady Honoria's use. The other is in the warming pantry for Mr. Pym. Different suppliers." "Different?" Alleyn repeated. "Lady Honoria prefers a farm in Sussex. It is stronger and less dusty, and prettier," Miss Calthorpe added, with a faint smile of someone indulging frivolity in a controlled measure. "The blossoms are whole." Alleyn looked at the jar. The intact blossoms matched the pollen ring on Fielding's cup. He did not reach for it. He did not need to. He asked, quite as if they were arranging a garden party, "When was this jar last used?" Miss Calthorpe's hand hovered a fraction too long over the lid. "Last night, I should think. Lady Honoria asked for a tisane before the bell." "And you prepared it?" "I measured the flowers." Mr. Pym took the tray. Alleyn left the still room with the sense that the Abbey's rituals, who asks, who measures, who carries, contained their own liturgy of loyalty. No one lied. They arranged truth according to the proprieties. He returned once more to the scriptorium, stood in the middle of the room, and turned slowly as if he were taking in a stage set. Ritual again presented its ledger. At Compline, shutters are drawn. Pym had found the door ajar, the shutters half closed. Books in the Vale House were aligned even on private shelves. Here, one folio showed a fraction more leather than its fellows, as if a hand not trained to Lady Honoria's severity had replaced it in haste. "Sir," Fox prompted after a moment. "A hand that knows the house," Alleyn said, "but not Pym's house." He did not add, yet whose hand he suspected had learned its way around both. He let the thought settle as dust settles on old stone and looked once more at the cup, whose floor Pym would never have allowed, and whose flowers did not come from Pym's shelf. There, in the courteous infractions of an ancient routine, the Abbey had placed a quiet finger toward motive and means. Outside, the bell tolled the quarter, decent, unemphatic. Alleyn listened as if to an answer, and then, because one must always be seen to move forward, asked for Lady Honoria. He imagined her composure arranging itself like porcelain on a tray that someone else had dared to lift. The Abbey resumed its measured breath after luncheon, as if the morning's discreet inquiries had been a passing draught, and the ancient place now drew its cloistered air more deliberately. In the chapter house, a company of young actors rehearsed postures for the dumb show, consulting a score of gestures with the seriousness of acolytes. From time to time, Miranda Lascelles watched them from the edge of the platform with a concentration so fixed it resembled prayer. Theo Armitage moved among his charges with economical hands, setting and resetting attitudes until silence itself looked choreographed. Alleyn, who had the gift of sitting in a corner without becoming part of the furniture, observed from the back, his attention half upon the stage, half upon those not fully concerned with it. Sir Julian stood in the doorway, his shoulders making a block in the light. Venetia drifted behind a pillar like a careful ghost. Dr. Ferris occupied a chair with the pose of a man equal to a viva voce. Mr. Pym appeared and vanished as if the Abbey had taught him its own form of disappearance. It was not new facts that occupied Alleyn, but a pattern of habits lightly broken. From the servants that morning he had gathered a small anthology of order. The key press in Lady Honoria's study, where the scriptorium key hung at an exact angle. The still-room ledger kept in Mrs. Corbett's careful hand, the nightly ritual of extinguishing lamps in a sequence as venerable as a psalm. Somewhere in that litany there had been a note off-pitch. The key replaced a fraction askew. The still-room page with one entry, chamomile, inked in a hand that was not Mrs. Corbett's and dated just before 9. A sprig of rosemary laid on Fielding's saucer when Mrs. Corbett, by habit, decorated only trays sent to Lady Honoria's rooms. It was the smallest of trespasses, and therefore the most revealing. At 3:30, Miss Ardingly, Lady Honoria's secretary, found him unobtrusively. She had a manner which implied that she might pass through rooms as dryly as paper, and might catch fire with an equal absence of fuss. "Inspector," she said in a low voice not meant to cross the flagstones, "there has been a small development in the morning room. Her ladyship does not wish to alarm anyone unnecessarily." He rose, and as they went, she supplied the minimum. Something had been left under Lady Honoria's door during luncheon. No one had seen by whom. Mr. Pym had found it when he brought in the coffee tray. Lady Honoria awaited them with that scrupulous poise which was, perhaps, her strongest shield against the world. On the writing table lay a plain envelope without address. Within, folded, a single sheet of paper bearing a few lines in a hand that purported to be Ambrose Fielding's. Alleyn read once and then again. The script was energetic, the tone familiar. It proposed a meeting in the scriptorium at the hour when the house is finally honest, and added a line that might have been bravado or jest. "You will not like what I show you, but you will be grateful." It was signed with the looped F. Fielding used on his canvases, at least if the catalogues told true. "Found now," Alleyn said, "not last night." He turned the sheet and regarded the back as if paper might disclose its loyalties. "May I ask, has anyone else seen this?" "Only Miss Ardingly and Mr. Pym. said Lady Honoria. "I confess it seems to me an unkind trick. Ambrose had no reason to play games with my doors." "Unkind indeed," Miss Ardingly murmured, "and ill-timed." Alleyn stood a moment with the note balanced on his fingertips. It was a good simulation, if simulation it was. Yet the impulse it invited, retrospective appointment, came with too neat a tale. He thought of the key hanging at its fractional slant. "Fox," he said, when his colleague entered at a discreet knock. "Bring the catalogue of Mr. Fielding's exhibition. I'd like to compare signatures." Fox made no more of it than a nod. Lady Honoria watched them with equable attention. In a quieter world, she might have been a very good ambassador. They had not reached the far end of this small business when a disturbance, so minute it would have been laughable in any other house, touched the air in the cloister. No more than a movement of heads, a soft inrush, a lapse of the common rhythm. Venetia Vale, coming through the archway by the south walk, moved rather more quickly than grace demanded and stopped with a hand on the stone. "Forgive me," she said to no one in particular, and then to Alleyn. "I have received a note. It asks me to meet someone in the chapter house after Vespers. It is signed with an initial only." She held it out, and he saw at once that it had been typed, neatly on a machine that knew its own limitations, the letters evenly tired. The paper matched Lady Honoria's stock. The phrasing was spare, almost clerical. An initial A placed like a seal. "May I?" he asked, and when she gave it he read it with the same impersonal curiosity he had brought to the first. Miss Vale was asked to lend her presence to a conversation about the matter of the sketch. There was no mention of threat, only an assumption of compliance. "Was it delivered to your room?" Lady Honoria asked, with the faintest shade of frost. "Or to the tray, perhaps?" "To my dressing table," Venetia said. "In my book of hours." Miranda Lascelles, who had entered behind her with a hush like a stage door closing, gave a small sound that might have been amusement and might have been sympathy. "We are being given our cues, Inspector. Someone has taken the play in hand." "It is sometimes useful," Alleyn said, returning her glance with mild courtesy, "to permit a stage manager to call the next scene, provided one chooses one's place in the wings." He handed the typed note to Fox and the supposed Fielding note to Miss Ardingly. "Please keep both safe," he said to her, "and if you could ensure that the typewriter in Lady Honoria's study is undisturbed until I see it, I should be obliged." Miss Ardingly's eyelids lowered by a fraction. "Of course." The Abbey absorbed the small disturbance with its customary grace. Outside, the bell for Vespers would be rung by Pym with the exact attention of a man who has never rung a bell differently. Within, Theo's actors held a freeze while he considered an alteration to the closing tableau. It was all very simple and very composed. Only Alleyn, standing with his hands lightly in his pockets, felt the air shift. The first death had been quiet and contained. Now a hand had entered the text. Modest, almost playful, but not innocent. It wrote where notes should not be, placed papers where voices did not carry, and invited meetings in rooms that already knew too much. He smiled, very faintly, as one might at a child playing with matches under observation. "After Vespers, then," he said, as if agreeing to something domestic. "We shall see who keeps appointments when the house is honest." The bell delivered its single, lucid note, and the great silence fell again, as impersonal and exact as snowfall. Alleyn stood in the cloister with his hands lightly clasped behind him, and allowed his thoughts to still, the better to notice what remained in motion. Silence, he had discovered long ago, drew out characteristic gestures as surely as conversation disguised them. Across the quadrangle, Lady Honoria sat very straight in a settle beneath an arched window, not reading, but holding a book open as one might hold a standard. She was a woman to guard things, houses, customs, people, against incoherence. If a secret required a sanctuary, she would supply it, and then insist on the rules. Sir Julian occupied his usual chair by the fire in the drawing-room, visible through a half-open door. He did not fidget. Soldiers did not. The only movement came in the slight flex and relax of his jaw, a rhythm faintly at odds with the measured breathing of the house. The pattern suggested a man who had decided something and regretted the necessity of having decided it. Miranda Lascelles arranged herself with studied simplicity on the far bench, head slightly bowed, hands folded. Even contrition, with Miranda, had a line and an economy that suggested rehearsal. Now and then, her eyes lifted towards the scriptorium wing. They lowered again with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite resolve. Theo Armitage walked slowly along the arc of the cloister, making of his hands a language. One finger traced a measure on the stone, a palm smoothed air as if laying dust. He kept time with a beat only he could hear. Stage men understood that what was not said must still be shaped. Venetia Vale sat nearest the garden, where the winter hedges held their green with quiet obstinacy. She wore composure as one might wear a shawl borrowed from an older relative, gracefully, with gratitude, but not as if it belonged to her. The little pulse in her throat spoke a different language. Dr. Ferris stood beneath a carved corbel and made a careful business of not observing anyone at all. Academic neutrality, Alleyn reflected, was a discipline learned over years and unlearned in a moment. Ferris's gaze slid once, only once, towards the scriptorium door and away. Pym, who most perfectly expressed the Abbey's ritual, was absent from view. In a silence that required no service, the servant's art became one of invisibility. Even that absence, Alleyn noted, had its place in the pattern. He let the pattern settle like dust on polished wood. A ritual, properly observed, became a map. The departure from it was the road. Last night had offered departures. A door left a finger's breadth ajar, a cup specified by its floor. Footsteps where there should have been none. A window that had been made to speak of seclusion by someone with a clever hand for mechanisms. He thought of Sarah's pale face and the way illness had claimed her after confession, and of the oily ring beneath Fielding's cup. There was an acrid note under the chamomile and honey from the Abbey's own hives. Honey masked, it did not cure. If a man insisted on his cracked cup, he advertised his habits to anyone who cared to look. Eccentricity served as a signature. It also served those who chose to write on his behalf. The poison, if poison it was, could have been prepared for the cup before the tray was set. It could have been added in passing. It could have been administered in the room by a visitor under the cover of the great silence, which made conspirators of shadows and accomplices of stone. The one constancy was the cup. Alleyn thought of hands that understood vessels and their uses. Kitchen hands, certainly, but also hands accustomed to props and properties, to the small deceits of stage and ceremony. Fielding's papers had been the more dangerous weapon. The missing portfolio, Theo's anxious report, Miranda's telephone call. Taken together, they suggested not avarice but preservation, not money, but form. Alleyn had met such motives before. The most enduring crimes were committed not for gain but for symmetry, for the maintenance of a pattern in which certain people had invested their peace. A revelation, placed at the wrong angle, shattered that pattern like dropped glass. He reviewed the guest list by nature rather than name. The guardian, who believed the place conferred virtue. The soldier, who had made harsh accommodations with necessity. The actress, for whom truth was a role that might be declined. The scholar, with a key in his mind for every old lock. The young man of the theatre, who knew how to make a door appear closed when it was meant to be opened. The girl, whose future required a pedigree without footnotes. Each, in his or her way, had reason to wish that Fielding's archaeology of secrets had remained unexcavated. He slipped into the chapter house and stood a moment on the shallow platform prepared for the dumb show. Gesture, he thought, was only speech without breath. Fielding had planned an unmasking that would have relied on silence as its instrument. How pretty, and how perilous. Someone had chosen a more absolute silence. Fox's steady presence came and went like a sentry's shadow. Arrangements had been set in motion without fuss. The laboratory would have what it needed. The telephone exchange would provide its small, reluctant treasures. The bee house would be visited. These were necessities. Yet Alleyn knew that the pivot was elsewhere. The pivot was a human decision taken before the tea was poured and the cup placed upon the oak. A decision framed in concern for order, expressed as an act of kindness or at least of tidiness. A courteous murder. He had seen them before. He would not, just yet, distribute his conclusions. They were only glimmerings, dust motes caught in a beam. Instead, he asked Lady Honoria, when the bell released their voices and people began to move with relief into speech, for a small courtesy. If I might this evening borrow the chapter house for a brief assembly after dinner. Nothing formal, a few quiet words. I should like, with your permission, to ask each of us to assist with a little reconstruction of ordinary movements. It seems to me we all value the Abbey's customs. They will help us. By all means, Inspector, Lady Honoria said. We will, of course, do whatever is proper. Precisely, Alleyn returned, with that softened inflection which meant more than it said. He walked back through the cloister. The gravel in the court had been re-raked, its patterns restored with loving accuracy. Only at the turn by the scriptorium door, where one does not think to look, a faint scuff marred the neatness. It would be there until someone, moved by habit, put it right. He let it be. Some disturbances were better left, just long enough to see who could not endure them. When the bell released the Abbey from its great silence, voices rose no higher than habit allowed. The company reformed itself with an unmistakable self-consciousness, as if each had been caught thinking too fluently. Alleyn used the moment to ask, with courteous finality, that no one leave that night and that the morrow's engagements be held generously, flexible. Lady Honoria made of this request a gracious decree. Composure, after all, is an art that improves with rehearsal. Fox, returning from a methodical prowl of the theatre wing, brought a small disturbance wrapped in his usual quiet. Found this, sir. In the properties chest for the dumb show, under the velvet masks. He offered a leather portfolio, whose corners bore the fraying of use. Within lay Fielding's studies, swift, exacting sketches annotated in a hand that had learned to look and then to think. One folio, however, had been removed, the stub of its bindings untidy against the rest. Theo, hovering with the proprietary unease of a man whose stages have become crime scenes, stared at the gap as if it might widen. It wasn't there earlier, he said, but without emphasis. He knew how such sentences sounded. Nor earlier still, Alleyn agreed, letting the pages show their logic without commentary. He stopped at a final leaf. A list of faces intended for the mask's dumb show: Lady Honoria, Sir Julian, Miranda, Dr. Ferris, Theo, and one other, unlabeled but unmistakable in outline. The missing folio, if it matched these keen preliminaries, would have contained Venetia. He closed the portfolio. Thank you, Mr. Armitage. I suspect it will prefer drier lodgings now. Theo inclined his head and went away with the careful step of one leaving a chapel. Alleyn sent Fox with the book to a locked drawer and asked Venetia, with a courtesy that made refusal ill-bred, to walk a little in the winter garden. The conservatory glass held the late light like a mild benediction. White cyclamen stood in ranks as if attending an unspoken service. Venetia's poise, obedient to its training, entered the room a pace before her. Miss Vale, Alleyn said, you are less surprised than some by the direction of our inquiries. She met his gaze as a dancer meets a cue. One might be surprised and not show it, Inspector. You seem to believe that a person is what she rehearses. I believe a person is what she chooses when there is no audience. He let the sentence rest. Fielding drew you. He drew us all. One drawing is missing. The absence speaks rather loudly. Venetia's hands were still, too still. The only movement was a pulse at the hollow of her throat. If Ambrose drew me, she said at last, it was without my consent. He liked to watch people arrive at themselves. And arrive you have. She smiled, and it was nearly brave. I have arrived where Lady Honoria asked me to stand. It is a position I am proud to hold. If you wish to know the pedigree of that position, Inspector, I can direct you to several impeccably bound volumes in the library. They will satisfy everyone but the volumes themselves. That is a cultivated answer. It is the only one that keeps faith with more than myself. A small breath escaped her. If Ambrose guessed at the bound and unbound leaves of my story, it was not my doing. I should be sorry if he had wished to publish it. I should be sorrier if anyone killed him for it. Did you fear that? Alleyn asked. She looked down at the cyclamen. One fears what one teaches people to love. Reputation is a sort of adoptive parent. It can be lost. He let her go without further pressure and found Sir Julian by the drawing-room fire, standing as if at some internal inspection. The General's profile, composed against the mullioned light, had the clean planes of decisions made when the world was noisier. Sir Julian, Alleyn said, a word, if you please. They took the cloister's outward path, where the herbaceous border, even in restraint, held its serried ranks, sage, rosemary, and the tall foxgloves whose dried spires remembered their summer bells. Sir Julian glanced at them with the impersonal recognition of a man who has eaten field rations and read Pliny. Digitalis, he said, and the faintest shade of contempt entered his voice. A vulgar substance when misapplied. You know it then. I commanded men through winters, Inspector. One knows the difference between a heart that is loyal and a heart that is weak, and how that weakness can be induced. But I am no apothecary. His jaw set. You think me a likely midnight gardener. I think you a man who has made a career of understanding the costs of concealment and the timing of retreats. Last night, during the silence, someone walked the cloister when no one should have. The parlour-maid heard it, that someone knew his way to the scriptorium window and its medieval tricks. Sir Julian's stick touched stone with a measured rhythm. Your parlour-maid has been unwell, I hear. Nerves make poor witnesses. As to latches, Dr. Ferris has given lectures here to parties of Americans that would teach a child to pick a 13th-century lock for the sake of scholarship. Scholars do not always disdain practice. And soldiers, Sir Julian returned, do not always take a hill because they can. He stopped, turned, and spoke in a tone that made petition sound like an order given inward. Venetia is not to be injured by this. Alleyn inclined his head. My duty is not to injure anyone, but to disturb as little as truth permits. Truth is an indifferent surgeon, Sir Julian said. One prefers a steady hand. They walked back in a silence that had nothing of the Abbey's rule about it. In the hall, Lady Honoria waited with the serenity of someone who has domesticated disaster. Inspector, she said, I can arrange the chapter house for tomorrow at noon, if that suits your sense of theatre. It suits my sense of proportion, Alleyn said. The Abbey is owed a certain manner. And its ghosts? She asked, almost lightly. They have the best seats, he replied. That night the corridors held their watch. Fox made his methodical rounds. The hall servants' steps were tuned to a lower key. Within the locked drawer the portfolio rested, articulate even in its silence. Somewhere in the house, a single torn study had found a more partisan guardian. Alleyn, at his window, let the Abbey's outline write itself across his thought. The pattern was almost complete. Only the thread of motive must be drawn cleanly through the cloth, so it would not pucker when shown. Tomorrow, under the patient vaulting of the chapter house, he would take that stitch. They gathered in the chapter house as the last of the day's light thinned across the stone. Lady Honoria, in a chair that made less of her than customarily. Sir Julian upright as if some invisible parade ground commanded it. Miranda composed to the point of fragility, Theo with his unobtrusive alertness, Venetia grave and still, like a portrait waiting to be named. Mr. Pym stood a little apart, the perfect distance for a servant who must see everything and appear to see nothing. Dr. Ferris chose his place near the carved bench beneath the sedalia, his hands folded with the care of a scholar in a library. Alleyn, who disliked orations, spoke as if he were confiding an observation not intended to travel far. The abbé, he seemed to imply, would keep the confidence. "I have come," he said, "to say what the stones already know. Mr. Fielding died not of mischance, but of design, digitalis from your own gardens, placed where it would do most good to the person who feared him, and most harm to him. The cup, his own with the crack he fancied, was daubed at the rim with a trace of bitter medicine disguised by oil, so that the first touch of his lips would take it, and no one else." Lady Honoria inclined her head once, as if acknowledging an unpleasant fact about the weather. "And the person, Inspector?" "A person with a practiced respect for ritual and a sufficient understanding of how ritual shapes behavior," Alleyn replied. "Someone who could trust the great silence to cloak a meeting, and who understood that Mr. Fielding would insist upon his familiar cup, even when the Abbey's porcelain stood ready. Someone who knew the scriptorium's latch as if it had been explained in a tutorial, and who had already spent several happy hours in those papers where the past preserves its grievances." Dr. Ferris's hands did not move, but his gaze went, just perceptibly, to the scriptorium door and back. He wore detachment like an academic gown. It hung well, and one almost forgot it could be put on and taken off. Alleyn continued, scarcely altering his tone. He wrote, 3 days before his death, that the pieces are falling into place. His letter did not reach its destination, but it told me enough. He had discovered that among Lady Honoria's guests was a gentleman who was not, strictly speaking, the gentleman he professed to be. Not in the legal sense. The claim was cleverly managed. A change of hyphenation here, auna, baptismal record there, a careful interment of one inconvenient marriage among the footnotes of family history. With the Abbey's documents, a man might make a future from a past that did not properly belong to him. Miranda's breath escaped with the faintest sound. Theo did not move at all. Venetia's stillness became, if possible, more complete. "The little things," Alleyn said, almost apologetically, "guessed it first. The oily ring beneath the cup had a ghost of lavender, a solvent more common, I am told, among scholars who handle vellum and old bindings than among painters or parlour maids. Mr. Fielding's cracked cup, left in the pantry for the evening ritual, bore a crescent smear on the handle, white at the edge, as if a man had dusted his fingers with pumice and oil to rid them of ink. Pym remembers, without comment, that Dr. Ferris returned a small decanter to the pantry that evening. The wrong shelf, sir. And that he apologized in a manner suggesting he had been where he ought not. Pym's face did not change. "The decanter was moved, Inspector. I put it right." "Quite." Alleyn let the word settle. The window, scratched by someone who knew enough of medieval latches to secure it from outside. The sort of thing a Cambridge man might explain in an after-dinner ramble about the charms of old iron. The telephone call to Miss Lascelles that proposed to be from Mr. Fielding's representative, intended to scatter the scent among older scandals. The portfolio stolen with discretion from a locked room, the one thing a theatre director would not have mistaken, but which a man used to catalogues and folios might lift and leave no mark. Dr. Ferris's voice, when it came, was almost tender with reason. "Inspector, you are kind enough to assume I am equal to all these abilities." "I assume only that you had to be equal to them," Alleyn returned gently. "You are very nearly so. Sarah's illness, do not be alarmed, Lady Honoria. proved to be largely fear. There was no digitalis in the servant's pot, but someone spoke to her at the back stair and told her she had said too much. To a child of her class, that is as effective as a draught. There was a small silence, of the sort one uses at an interment. Alleyn turned at last, not unkindly, to the scholar by the sedilia. "You came here looking for cover, Dr. Ferris, and found documents you could bend to your service. It would have prospered, perhaps, if Mr. Fielding had not been an uncomfortably good reader of character. He sketched you, sir, not your face, which is agreeable enough, but your habit of borrowing robes. He notes in a neat hand, borrowed authority, borrowed name. He was not tactful. He meant to exhibit the truth. You meant at any cost to prevent the exhibition." Dr. Ferris stared at his folded hands as if they were a text that had betrayed him. "It is a narrow thing," he said at last, very quietly, "to have one's life taken away by a line in a margin." "It is narrower," Alleyn said, with no emphasis, "to have one's life taken away by a cup." Lady Honoria's hand, which had been still upon the chair arm, moved with enormous grace to straighten a tassel that had never been crooked. "What is to be done, Inspector?" "For the moment," Alleyn replied, "nothing more than civility requires. Mr. Fox will sit with Dr. Ferris. We will avoid the garden, if you please, and any mention of foxgloves. In the morning, we shall go to town." He did not look at Venetia as he said it. It was possible that her breath had resumed its proper rhythm. It was possible that it had not. The Abbey, which had kept worse confidences, took back its silence with its usual composure. The formalities, when they came, were conducted with the Abbey's own discretion. Catherine, no longer Venetia, sat in Lady Honoria's private study, her hands folded on the blotter as if awaiting a music lesson rather than the slow machinery of law. Fox stood by the door with an air of solid patience. A woman constable from the village had been summoned and installed with quiet tact. Lady Honoria, having offered tea and found it refused, allowed her presence to serve in its stead. "I shall give you a full statement, Inspector," Catherine said, "not to bargain, but to foreclose embroidery. I should dislike the story improved." "You have my word it won't be," Alleyn replied. The phrase, simple as it was, carried the authority of a vow made in good paper and ink. The village doctor, a precise little man with hands that suggested long practice in country necessities, had already been and gone. Sarah would recover. The dose, as Catherine had intended, was not designed to kill. The doctor's phrase, ill-advised herbal administration, had pleased Mrs. Hartwell by sparing the girl the uglier word. Sarah, white-faced but determined, sent down a message for Mr. Pym. She would return to duty when permitted, as the trays would not carry themselves. Sir Julian came at noon with the bleak kindness of men who have written too many letters to too many families. He asked no questions. He merely said, "Miss Thornfield," and the old title of respect, shifted to accommodate the truth, performed more comfort than any homily. Miranda Lascelles came afterwards and did what actresses of her school do best. She made a small, unimportant business of straightening a cushion, and in doing so permitted a moment's human contact without claiming it. Dr. Ferris brought a solicitor from Cambridge who spoke with unembarrassed competence and a preference for paper over passion. He arranged for Catherine's transfer in the afternoon, drafted the necessary protections for the Abbey's archives, and nodded gravely when Alleyn asked that certain materials be sealed pending trial. "Lives to be lived, Inspector," he said. "One may defend society without auctioning its furniture." The missing portfolio emerged not as a flourish, but as an errand. Catherine, after signing, said, "There is a stone seat in the south ambulatory, a sedile, I think Lady Honoria calls it. If one reaches behind with care, there is a recess. I put it there after midnight." Fox, dispatched with Pym, returned with the thing wrapped in sacking, its contents examined by Alleyn in the library, whereas Fielding had left them. Studies, annotations, a draft letter that had not been sent. There were sketches of faces now present in the chapter house. There were also careful notes on a child long dead and a marriage that had not taken place. It seemed appropriate that those last items should never leave their paper lives. Alleyn closed the portfolio and placed it in the solicitor's keeping with instructions as precise as prayers. The inquest opened at once and adjourned with the usual economy of tragedy. A medical account, a formal identification, a verdict deferred while the Crown prepared its case. Lady Honoria attended in a dark coat that had acquired its dignity long ago and had never lost it. Afterwards, she returned to the Abbey and told Mrs. Hartwell to see that the staff had a proper supper. "We shall not fast because we are unhappy," she said. "That is heathen." Theo, who had been excused from the masks' obligations by the only authority that mattered, the general collapse of appetite for such contrivances, went quietly through the chapter house and spoke to his company with almost monastic gentleness. "We shall work again when the Abbey asks us," he said. "It will ask in time." He then took Fielding's sketched stage directions and put them away in a drawer with nothing theatrical in the gesture at all. Toward evening, the great silence bell was rung as usual. The company, diminished and altered, observed it without command. In that hour, Alleyn walked the cloister with the deliberate tread of a man who respected both the stones and the minds they had sheltered. He paused where the foxgloves leaned over the garden path, their bells gone to seed and innocence, and thought of a desperate young woman who had copied herself into a life that was not hers until the copying became indistinguishable from being. Justice, he knew, would follow its course. There would be charges and a courtroom and language too explicit to be entirely truthful. Yet there was also the other justice, the sort the Abbey practiced. A withdrawal of patronage, a closing of certain doors, a quiet recalibration of place. Catherine would meet the public consequences. The rest of them would meet the private ones. Sir Julian's jaw would work over unspoken regrets. Dr. Ferris would take down a book and then another, reading for the comfort of structure. Miranda would stand before a mirror with the lamps dimmed and reconsider how one listens. Lady Honoria would attend to her hives, the bees conducting their severe and consoling business. In the butler's pantry, Mr. Pym polished a glass with his characteristic economy of gesture and set it neatly with its companions. He did not change the order of their standing. One does not reorder an alphabet because a single word has gone wrong. When the hour ended, conversation resumed in lower keys. No one spoke Fielding's name at once. The air did not ask it of them. Alleyn, returning to the library, found the portfolio's absence on the desk as eloquent as its presence had been. He stood for a time without moving, and in that stillness the case settled into its place among his other cases. Not finished, such things never finished, but sufficiently arranged to permit the mind to lay down its tools. Outside, the light thinned over the cloister grass. The Abbey kept its treaty with time, and Alleyn, who was not given to pieties, felt nevertheless that there were moments when the only adequate comment was quiet. He would write his report in the morning. Tonight he accepted the House's rule and let the silence do, in its limited fashion, what justice could not.